frei. Fehlerlos der Torwart aus Zwickau. Sparwasser. Und Tor! Ein blitzschneller Konter des Mittelfelds in Windeseile überblickt und unter mir ein Wald von schwarz-rot-goldenen Fahnen mit Hammer und Zirkel.
In Hamburg on the 22nd of June 1974, the crowning moment of East German football took place. In the 77th minute of the group stage game against World Cup host and bitter rivals West Germany, Jürgen Sparwasser scored a goal that will go down in history. The first and only time that East and West Germany faced off in a major tournament resulted in a 1-0 victory to the GDR. Its political significance was lost on nobody. The game represented a conflict between two ways of life, two different paths for Germany, and it was socialism that prevailed. Sadly, the GDR only finished 6th whilst West Germany went on to win, but let's skim over that. The GDR beat the West on the day. With Euros 2020 coming to a close and the Marxist knee-taking England side reaching the final, it's hard to ignore the politics of football. From the opulence in the game, the racist violence of hooligans, up to the corrupt and outward touch owners and federations who disregard fans for pure profit and greed. Modern football is clearly broken. Which begs the question, does it have to be this way? Absolutely not, as the example of the beautiful game in the German Democratic Republic testifies. The efforts to protect a working class sport in a workers' state can give us a few pointers on the socialist alternative to the state of the game today. Firstly, let's run through some of the GDR's achievements. Compared to its western neighbour, they certainly appear modest. The GDR only ever reached one World Cup in 1974 and never qualified for the Euros, leading some to call it the world champion in friendlies. 1974 was also the year of the first and only GDR team to win the European Cup Winners' Cup, that being FC Magdeburg. Compare this to the West, which won 3 World Cups between 1954 and 1990, and you'll be forgiven for dismissing the GDR as a failure. However, statistically speaking, with adjustments for population, the GDR achieved more than England, France and Italy. In addition, the scouting and youth development system, which led many West German clubs to success, was an almost direct replica of that employed by the East German clubs, specifically Dynamo Dresden. Whilst the GDR had little luck with silverware, UEFA ranked the Oberliga, the GDR's first division, as the 7th most competitive league in 1976, and the national team was ranked in the top 3rd in the world. This is also without mentioning Olympic success, as the GDR won bronze twice in Tokyo and Munich, silver in Moscow and gold in Montreal. It's clear from this that the GDR was a thriving hub for football. All this conveys the image of a small nation punching far above its weight, and this can be directly attributed to socialist policies. The GDR was committed to creating a society which valued sport and fitness, as Walter Ulbricht stated simply, everyone, everywhere, sports once a week. Much of the credit for this is owed to the DTSB, or the National Sports Federation, which was a mass organisation with 3.7 million members by 1989. Adult members would pay 1.3 marks and children only 20 pfennigs for access to sports facilities at over 10,000 clubs. This meant that sport and fitness were highly accessible to all aspects of society, rather than what we see today, where it's often locked away for many by extortionate members' fees. Sports were also encouraged and well supported at schools as a key aspect of a socialist education, with many children joining the GST, the Society for Sports and Technology, whilst talented students could go to specialised sports colleges for free. It was this state support for sport and the application of the idea that all should be able to engage in it without barriers that allowed the GDR to rear a disproportionately high amount of talent. This was a long process though, as the country was devastated by the Second World War. For example, 301 out of the 426 gymnasiums in Berlin were destroyed, leaving much to be rebuilt. Whilst football was largely unpopular in Eastern Germany before the war, it swiftly became a game for the people, with street football akin to that in Brazil or the north of England sweeping Aussies by storm. This progressed into workers inspired by anti-fascist and communist fan circles which survived the Third Reich, establishing their own factory football teams, thereby wiping the slate clean of Nazism, as officials and clubs from before the war were fully banned by 1950. Compare this to West Germany, where clubs and officials with tainted Nazi past were maintained and even revived. The DFB even kept the same structures from when they expelled Jewish players from German football in the 1930s. The lines were therefore drawn clearly: new progressive, denazified, worker-owned clubs, or the traditional clubs festering with Nazism. It must be said though, that East German football was initially defined by chaos, as clubs with no roots changed names frequently and even moved about the country. The most severe example of this was the army team, Vorwärts. They moved from Leipzig to Berlin in 1953 and again to Frankfurt an der Oder in 1971, and this was accompanied by 13 different name changes. There was some attempt at establishing order though in 1954 with the founding of 8 established Oberliga teams designed to be the most competitive. While standing separate from the grassroots factory teams, these 8 clubs were still linked to workplaces. For example, every player in Dynamo Dresden would work his day job in the police, just like a player in Lokomotiv Leipzig would spend his days on the railways. So to see what a socialist football team looked like, let's use the Magdeburg side, which beat AC Milan 2-0 to lift the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1974 as a case study. The average age for players was 23, and each one came from the 11,000 square mile county of Magdeburg with a population of only 1 million. This was an incredibly local team, with only Celtic in 1967 being comparable as a side which won in Europe with purely local players. Many of the players worked in the nearby Ernst Thälmann heavy industry plant, cycling to training after work before sharing a few beers together. The team was also innovative in its offensive style, contrasting to the more stale defensive tactics of Catenaccio, and many went on to represent the GDR in the World Cup, with the aforementioned goal scorer Sparwasser himself playing for Magdeburg. This example from one of the greatest Oberliga sides tells us that footballers in the GDR were proudly working class and, most importantly, amateurs. There were no super riches for players in East Germany. They remained workers first and foremost. Granted, there were some benefits, for example a slightly higher wage, easier access to a detached house, a car and foreign travel, but this was mostly for the superstars. Many and most footballers actually lived in dorms owned by the factory or the club. This meant that there was no disconnect between player and fan. They worked together, drank together, and shared in their team's highs and lows together. Players as amateurs was a sacred principle in the GDR from its inception to its demise, as it was the only country in the socialist bloc to oppose Gorbachev's reforms to professionalise sport, only giving way days before the wall fell. Teams also remained so local because of the limited number of delegations, what they called transfers, in the GDR. To leave a club was usually met with outrage by fans, and to go to a more successful club was treachery. After dodgy underground transfer deals involving incentives like extra pay or a nicer house were banned in the 1970s following anti-corruption laws, local talent often remained local, which meant the clubs truly represented their area. Just imagine if we had this today, your club would represent the best of your city, not the depth of your owners' pockets. Footballers in the GDR were also revered as socialist role models, diplomats in tracksuits even. Despite low levels of SED membership amongst players, they were more than willing to be political. For example, the 1957 Oberliga champions Wismut Karl-Marx-Stadt began a voting campaign for the SED in the elections, and Vorwärts Berlin drummed up support for the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Players, as workers, were also active in the 1953 strikes, often having a strong voice in which way a factory would swing. Some strongly supported strike action to improve socialism, others strongly defended the government, whilst others joined in for access to better equipment like boots. But consistently, their calls were a defence of the socialist system. It was to be reformed, not overthrown. Their approval of socialism can be seen by the low rates of Republikflucht, or the act of fleeing to the west. Despite having many chances to do so when playing in Europe, only 20 players ever did so, 8 of them doing it in 1989. A large issue that exists in the GDR was the state's fixation on Olympic medals rather than international football, which meant the national team often did not get the support that it deserved. The government only reluctantly celebrated the 1974 win over West Germany because the team were being hailed as heroes of the people. Because they didn't win a trophy, the DSTB were disappointed by the 6th place finish. A silver lining of this relative neglect, though, meant that East German football was largely spared from the systemic doping which blights the country's Olympic success. It was far more beneficial to dope medal winners than a less successful team, playing a game purely based on skill rather than physicality. However, if you do want examples of Germans doping in football, you need only look westward. A 2013 study by the Humboldt University in Berlin discovered that the West German national team doped in 3 World Cup finals. After this brief introduction to the deep rabbit hole of East German football, we have to cover what happened after the fall of socialism. To put it simply, East German football did not get the best deal out of capitalism and was decimated by reunification. The best players were poached by the West for far less than their worth to pursue the riches and glory promised in the sunlit uplands of the Bundesliga, only to be burned out and scrapped a few years later. The others were left to flounder, as only 2 Oberliga teams were permitted to join the first division of the Bundesliga, the rest falling into the lower leagues. In the confusion, players were sold low and bought high, as workers were stripped of the ownership of their clubs to be bought off by West German businessmen looking to fill their wallets. As an example, Dynamo Dresden's owner was actually imprisoned for embezzlement. All this meant that teams like Dynamo Dresden, who were playing in the UEFA Cup semi-finals in 1989, are now in the 3rd tier of German football, along with past European champions like Magdeburg. Dynamo Berlin, who dominated the Oberliga for a decade and were competing in cup winner quarter-finals, are now in the 4th tier. Their talent was stripped, their finances decimated, and all the sporting facilities built to inspire and nurture the next generation of talent were closed. Eastern football went entirely unrepresented in the First Division from 2009 to 2020, when Union Berlin were finally promoted, a club that was in the 2nd Division of East German football and saved from bankruptcy by the passion of its fans in a stadium built by its fans. Union Berlin can proudly claim a strong tradition of representing socialist values in a capitalist world. And before you say it, RB Leipzig absolutely does not count as an East German team. Eastern football, much like the entirety of Eastern Germany, has been left to crumble since the so-called reunification. This leads us on to conclusions. The GDR offers lessons in what socialist football can look like, a different path from that we walk down now. The future of football looks grim. With ever-rising ticket prices, the mass working class support for football will simply be priced out as the game is gentrified. The game is run for profit, not for the working class. The blatant corruption of owners such as the Glazers at Scum United, Roman Abramovich at Chelsea and the blood money that fuels Man City is our new normal. Owners who don't just ignore the fans, but hold them in contempt, as was so recently exemplified with the disgrace that was the so-called Super League, which would have seen the core value of sporting merit auctioned off for greater shares of TV money. We can reject this. We can create a future of socialist football with complete ownership of our clubs, full support for sports facilities to rear talent which is stifled by poverty, and recreate the bond between player and supporter. Football would be and is nothing without the working class. It's time we take back what was stolen from us. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction into the world of East German football. I certainly could have gone down a lot more tangents. I could have talked about the fan cultures, the hooliganism that happened, and of course the controversies around Dynamo Berlin. But I decided that maybe that's one for another time. I thought I'd stick to this introduction, and you can read as much more as you like about anything. I'd absolutely recommend the book Turning Season, which is a nice little primer for the world of East German football, and one that I can absolutely recommend that one. I'd also like to thank Scottish Proletarian as well, who is an excellent new up-and-coming socialist YouTuber about specifically Scottish history, for colorising the picture of the Sparvasser goal for the thumbnail. It's a beautiful picture, and I think I had to put it out there. It's one for the history books, that one. Yeah, so absolutely go check him out. He's a great guy, and he's got an excellent channel going on there. This will be my last video on the GDR for a little bit of time now. It's started to burn me out a little bit, to be honest. I'd like to focus more on British and Irish communist and socialist history. So GDR videos will still happen, just not as regularly as they happen now. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to thank my excellent, indomitable and incredible patrons who have stuck through me for these last month where I've been a bit inactive. Without further ado, the Helden der Arbeit, the heroes who we all look on with awe. I'd like to thank Awu, Deep Red Wine, Ellis and Evan. Of course, the pipe men as well, who have earned a good drink now the Euros are coming to a bit of a close. I'd like to thank Cap, Comrade Dave, Hodger Enjoyer, Isdan Ball, Max McNally, Ryan Wilkinson and the Cheerful Comrade. And of course the party comrades as well, who are always there through thick and thin. I'd like to thank Base and Superstructure, Berrimans, Graham Live, Hagen Michels, Jaden Michaela Jones, Jimbo Dog, Martin Barakov, Mod Sognia, Fizcool, Simon Bullador Colbert and Skelson. Thank you for watching. Like I say, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one. Down at you, comrades.